Two bodies lay on the floor of a small apartment, a girl and her neighbor. Blood was everywhere, on the furniture, the walls, the floor. They were killed by a man with Down syndrome, obsessively in love with one of them. His addiction escalated into violence, and unrequited feelings culminated in a double murder. The crime that later shocked a small American town began with a seemingly ordinary neighborly encounter. The main player in the events was a 25-year-old man named Daniel. He had suffered from Down syndrome since childhood. His parents had long cared for him, trying to ensure his socialization, but after his mother's death and his father's move to another state, he was left virtually alone. Daniel received welfare, occasionally held simple jobs, lived in a modest apartment, and struggled to fit in, where he was perceived as more of a special neighbor. The central figure in his life was a girl named Emily. She was 22 years old, a student at a local college, and lived nearby in a rented apartment. Emily was known for her kindness and attentiveness to people. This is precisely what attracted Daniel. She helped him with his shopping, was a listening ear, and was supportive. For her, this was an act of ordinary humanity. For him, it was an event of great significance. Gradually, Emily's friendly attention began to feel exclusive to Daniel. He began to consider her his girlfriend, even though there was no real relationship between them. In his mind, she became the center of his world, and any action she took that didn't match that image provoked jealousy and aggression. The situation was complicated by the presence of Sarah, Emily's neighbor and close friend. She often visited Emily, helped with housework, and sometimes stayed overnight. For Daniel, Sarah became a symbol of threat. He saw her as a rival, although in reality, there was no conflict between them. Gradually, he stopped greeting her, sometimes making direct accusations, claiming that she was interfering with his relationship with Emily. People around her began to notice strange things. Daniel was increasingly waiting for Emily at the entrance to her apartment, calling her late at night, and showing up at the college where she studied. She tried to explain to friends that he was just a neighbor, but in reality, she was becoming concerned. Sarah, meanwhile, openly told her friend that Daniel was behaving intrusively and could be dangerous. Hints of intimacy began to appear in their relationship, only on Daniel's part. He allowed himself to say that Emily had to be his alone, trying to hold her embrace longer than friendship allowed. Emily always pulled away, but he perceived this not as a rejection, but as a temporary difficulty. His attachment intensified, turning into an obsessive dependency. The situation became increasingly tense for Emily. At first, she didn't pay much attention to his attention, considering it gratitude for his help. But with each passing month, Daniel's demands grew more insistent. He wanted to know where she'd been, who she'd been seeing, and reacted jealously to any story she told about her friends. Despite his mental limitations, Daniel was physically strong. He practiced simple exercises at home, and this strength later proved fatal. His outward clumsiness belied his growing inner tension. By mid-year, their relationship had ceased to be a friendship. For Emily, it had become a burden. For Daniel, a question of existence. She increasingly tried to cut off contact, and he perceived this as a betrayal. To his neighbors, he remained a quiet guy, but in reality, his inner world was consumed by the idea of possessing Emily. After Daniel and Emily began communicating regularly, his dependence grew stronger with each passing month. He began spending more time near her apartment, finding excuses to approach her, asking for help, or offering small favors. At first glance, this seemed like a desire for friendship, but in reality, it increasingly resembled control. Emily tried to be kind to him. She didn't want to offend her neighbor. She understood that his condition made him vulnerable. But at some point, her tolerance became a problem. Daniel increasingly expected her to pay attention to him. If this didn't happen, he responded with outbursts of irritation and harsh words. Emily found his jealousy particularly difficult to bear. When other acquaintances were around, Daniel would become aggressive. He would interrupt conversations, asking questions about who exactly was with her and why he had come. He would often say that no one has the right to take her away from him. Such statements frightened Emily, although she tried to perceive them as emotional, not as a real threat. Sarah, Emily's close friend and frequent visitor, increasingly became the target of his hostility. Daniel blamed her for Emily's lack of reciprocation. He repeatedly tried to provoke arguments, accusing Sarah of meddling in other people's affairs. To others, this seemed like a strange hostility, but for Daniel, Sarah became the personification of an obstacle to his imagined relationship. Gradually, the boundaries of his behavior shifted. He began dropping into the apartment uninvited if the door was left ajar, and would show up late at night under the pretext of needing help or wanting to ask something. Emily tried to explain that such visits were unacceptable, but he continued to come. People around her increasingly advised her to end the contact, but she hesitated to take any drastic action, believing it could provoke an unpredictable reaction. At the same time, his attempts to romanticize their relationship intensified. He gave her small gifts, cheap jewelry, sweets, cards, and sometimes homemade crafts. They would even mention how they should be together. When Emily said she didn't see him as a partner, he would become offended and withdraw, but would return to the topic again shortly afterward. Intimacy was rare, but each time it became extremely unpleasant for her. He would hint that they should try to be closer, and once tried to kiss her without her consent. Emily pulled away, sternly explaining that this was not allowed. For Daniel, such a refusal was perceived as humiliation, intensifying the internal conflict. Over time, the tension reached a level where even casual encounters became a source of anxiety. Emily began avoiding him, leaving the house at different times and trying to cut short their conversations. But the less she interacted with him, the more intense his obsession became. Daniel couldn't cope with the feeling of loss. He perceived any absence from her as betrayal or infidelity. The situation was further complicated by domestic circumstances. Daniel increasingly complained to neighbors that Emily was turning away from him, saying she needed to understand that he loved her. His words began to sound increasingly aggressive. In one conversation, he declared that he wouldn't allow anyone to ruin their bond. Emily, meanwhile, felt the pressure growing. Sarah urged her to cut off contact, saying the situation was becoming dangerous. But Emily hesitated to take any decisive steps. She still hoped that Daniel would come to terms with her and that their communication would gradually fade away. In reality, the opposite was happening. Each refusal only strengthened his conviction that he had to get his way. His obsession reached a point where rational arguments ceased to matter. Daniel became increasingly withdrawn, and any attempt by her to distance herself became confirmation that Sarah or others were working against him. During this period, his internal tension reached its breaking point. Outwardly, he continued to appear a quiet, calm neighbor, but in conversations with certain people, he increasingly hinted that this can't go on. These words weren't yet perceived as a direct threat, but they already concealed the impending tragedy. The events leading up to the tragedy unfolded rapidly. In the weeks leading up to the murder, the relationship between Daniel and Emily completely lost any semblance of friendship. She increasingly avoided communication, stopped answering calls, and limited her correspondence. Daniel reacted to this with resentment and anger. He called her dozens of times in a row and would stand at her door for hours, waiting for her to come out. Emily tried to explain that she needed space, but such words only increased his anxiety. He perceived them not as a request, but as a threat to lose the only meaningful connection he had. During this period, his behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Sarah actively intervened. She urged her friend to cut off all contact with Daniel and, if necessary, to contact the police. Emily was hesitant. She felt sorry for her neighbor and still hoped his feelings would fade. But at the same time, her fear grew. Several times, she spotted him near the college, standing nearby and watching her. A few days before the murder, a conflict occurred that proved crucial. Emily returned home late one evening with Sarah. Daniel was waiting for her at the entrance. He began asking questions about why she was so late and where she had been. Sarah intervened, trying to stop the conversation. In response, he lost his temper, accusing her of turning Emily against him and shouting that she couldn't live without him. Emily tried to calm him down, but he abruptly left, slamming the door. This episode greatly frightened her friends. The next day, Emily decided to cut off contact completely. She didn't answer his calls, and when he arrived, she asked him to leave. Her words carried a harshness that hadn't been there before. For Daniel, this signaled his final rejection. Internally, he experienced it as a catastrophe. His obsession with having the right to Emily transformed into a willingness to act. Over the next 24 hours, his neighbors noticed his behavior. He walked down the street, talking to himself, and repeatedly mentioned that they all betrayed him. At a nearby store, he bought a knife, explaining to the clerk that he was going to cook some meat. To those around him, it seemed ordinary, but in his mind, the purchase had a different meaning. Meanwhile, Emily and Sarah discussed what to do next. Sarah insisted on going to the police, but Emily was still hesitant. She didn't believe anyone would take her complaints seriously, as Daniel hadn't previously committed any actual violence. Their conversation boiled down to a decision to limit all contact, and if the situation didn't improve, to actually seek help. In the last 2 days before the murder, Emily rarely left her alone. Sarah was almost constantly by her side. This irritated Daniel even more. He believed his friend was deliberately blocking him from Emily. His jealousy reached an extreme level. His statements were veiled, though threatening. He said that no one can take her away from him, that they will be together forever. That evening, a few hours before the tragedy, he tried to contact Emily again. She didn't open the door or answer his phone. Neighbors later reported hearing his footsteps and muttering in the hallway. He knocked several times, but the door remained unanswered. He then left, returning late that night. Daniel's inner state at that moment could be described as a mixture of despair and determination. His dependence on Emily had become an obsession. She had no right to exist without him. His distorted perception had become convinced that if she wasn't with him, she wouldn't be with anyone. All the signs of impending disaster were already evident, but those around them failed to recognize them in time. Emily and Sarah prepared for the next day, discussing plans, unaware that this would be their last night. By this point, Daniel had finally made the decision that would end his suffering. The night of the murder fell in silence. It was around 2 a.m. when Daniel reappeared at Emily's house. He had brought with him a kitchen knife he had bought the day before. His steps were leisurely, but a plan had already formed in his mind. Neighbors later recalled seeing him at the entrance at that time, standing motionless, as if waiting for a signal. Emily was with Sarah in her apartment. The girls spent the evening together, talking and trying to ignore their neighbor's odd behavior. Before bed, Emily texted her friend that they should discuss going to the police the next day. It was her first real intention to resolve the situation, but they didn't make it until morning. Daniel managed to get into the building. The front door wasn't locked that evening. After reaching the right floor, he stood outside Emily's door for several minutes. According to his own testimony during interrogation, he waited for her to come out and talk to him. When that didn't happen, he quietly checked the handle and discovered the door wasn't locked with the top lock. He walked inside. The lights in the apartment were off, except for a faint glow from a bedside lamp in the bedroom. Daniel walked down the hallway and opened the door. Emily and Sarah were asleep. At that moment, he said he experienced a strong surge of anger and resentment. He saw another woman next to Emily and perceived it as the ultimate betrayal. The first blow landed on Sarah. She woke up from the noise and tried to jump up, but Daniel had already stabbed her in the chest. She screamed, but her cry was cut off as the blows followed one after another. Emily woke up and, realizing what was happening, screamed his name, trying to stop him. She rushed toward him, but was stabbed in the shoulder herself. A brief but furious struggle ensued. Emily tried to push her attacker away, wresting the knife from his hand, but he was physically stronger. Several blows landed on her chest and stomach. She fell to the floor next to the bed. Sarah, by this time, showed no signs of movement. Blood quickly splattered the floor and sheets. Daniel continued to stab until both girls stopped moving. According to the forensic examination, Sarah received at least 10 stab wounds, most of which were to the heart and lungs. Emily was stabbed 8 times, 2 of which were fatal to the heart and liver. After the murder, he remained in the apartment for some time. Footprints showed that he walked through the rooms, leaving bloody footprints. He sat down at the kitchen table and remained there for about 20 minutes. Then he left, leaving the door open. The bodies weren't discovered until the morning. Neighbors heard the apartment door ajar and called the building's owner. When he entered, he found a horrific scene. 2 young women lying in the room, with signs of a struggle and blood on the floor and walls. The police arrived within half an hour. The crime scene left no doubt about the intent. A knife with traces of blood, along with Daniel's shoe prints and fingerprints, was found on the floor. Investigators immediately tracked him down. He hadn't fled and had returned home. When he was apprehended, he was sitting on the couch, his clothes stained with blood. When asked about his actions, he calmly replied, "They wanted to take her from me. I couldn't let that happen." It became clear to the police that the murder was personal and motivated by obsession. The lack of any attempt to escape only confirmed that Daniel had acted impulsively, succumbing to internal pressure. Witnesses questioned that same day confirmed that he had made threats several days before the tragedy. A neighbor recalled hearing him say, "I won't let them take her." No one had previously taken these words seriously. Thus, the night of the murder became the tragic denouement of the story. For Emily and Sarah, it was all over in a matter of minutes. For Daniel, however, another stage began, one of investigation and trial. After Emily and Sarah's bodies were discovered, police immediately secured the crime scene. A forensic team worked in the apartment, documenting traces of blood, fingerprints, and the knife left by the killer. The evidence pointed to Daniel from the very beginning. He was apprehended without resistance. He was at home, sitting on the couch, wearing the same clothes that still had blood stains. During interrogation, Daniel did not deny his involvement. His words were simple and direct. He claimed he had to do it because Emily belonged to him. Investigators noted no attempt to hide or cover his tracks. Everything pointed to a spontaneous yet purposeful crime, driven by personal obsession. Psychiatrists involved in the case confirmed that he had intellectual disabilities associated with Down syndrome. However, they pointed out that Daniel understood the nature of his actions and the consequences. He was aware that he was stabbing and did so with the intent to kill. This became a key argument for the court. His diagnosis did not exempt him from criminal liability. Witnesses, neighbors, acquaintances, and college staff testified that he had become increasingly obsessive over the past few months. Several people heard him threaten Sarah and say that no one has the right to take Emily away from him. These testimonies reinforced the picture of intent. The trial was held amid intense media attention. Local media covered the case in detail, highlighting the defendant's unusual personality. Relatives of the victims attended the hearings, demanding a harsh sentence. The defense attorney attempted to argue partial insanity, but the court found Daniel guilty of double murder. The verdict was unambiguous: life imprisonment without parole. The judge noted that, despite his health, the defendant posed a serious danger to others and committed deliberate acts that resulted in the deaths of 2 people. For society, this case has become an example of how the combination of mental health issues, social isolation, and lack of supervision by loved ones can lead to tragedy. Daniel's case became a reminder that even seemingly harmless addiction can lead to tragedy. Unrequited feelings, mental illness, and a lack of control resulted in a double murder. This story has become etched in the city's memory as a symbol of lost vigilance.